Welcome to the video with helpful hints for the chapter covering abortion and ectopic pregnancy. When coding for abortions, it is important to remember that ICD-10-CM rules for classifying abortions do not necessarily correlate to state-specific fetal death reporting requirements. In a workplace setting, this is very important to keep in mind as those fetal death reporting requirements do vary state to state. In ICD-10-CM, abortions are classified by type. These types include spontaneous, where no instruments or chemical interventions are used, it just happens naturally. Complications following induced termination of pregnancy. This type identifies complications that arise after an abortion procedure, whether the abortion was for therapeutic or treatment purposes or whether it was for elective reasons. And then failed attempt termination of pregnancy. This type identifies when an induced abortion fails and the patient is actually still pregnant. Two more terms to be familiar with in this chapter are complete and incomplete. Complete abortions are when all of the products of conception are expelled from the uterus. On the other hand, incomplete abortions are when some of the products of conception have been expelled, yet some of the products of conception are still retained within the uterus. So it's important to understand the difference here. When coding for abortion procedures in your PCS codebook, you will code to the obstetrics-related route operation of abortion. So that keeps it pretty simple. As you can see, there are a limited number of subterms listed as options for us as well. There is one common procedure related to this chapter that the handbook does not really review, but for those of you wishing to code as a career, I think it's a good one to have on your radar screen just to become familiar with this. It's probably worth a quick note in your handbook or even in your PCS codebook. And the procedure is dilation and curettage. You often hear this called a D&C procedure. With this procedure, the cervix is dilated, so the cervix is dilated, and an instrument called a curettage, a curette is inserted to scrape away the uterine lining for any remaining products of conception. So think incomplete or spontaneous abortion here. A D&C is coded to the root operation of extraction, which we've talked about before, but here we will pull in again that subterm body part products of conception. Then we will come down here to the subterm retained, meaning the retained products of conception within the uterus. We're sort of taking the same route we took for, say, a C-section. Remember, we had the classical C-section here. But we're just going to be using this subterm of retained instead. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example from exercise 24.2. Therapeutic abortion complete, 10 weeks gestation, performed because of severe reactive psychosis, vaginal vacuum abortion. Here we have an elective procedure, and when we have an elective procedure, it is going to be our reason for admission. If you remember back to the use of Z codes, that's the path we're going to take here for this principal diagnosis. So we don't really have a diagnosis where something's wrong, right? We're doing an elective procedure. So we are going to go to the main term and counter for subterm termination of pregnancy elective. That is why the patient is presenting to the hospital specifically for this elective procedure. This leads us to our principal diagnosis code of Z33.2. Then we will pull in the pregnancy code. Pregnancy complicated by mental disorder. This will lead us to code 099.34, and then the 1 will be added in the tabular list, which you find when you get there is pulling in the notation of the first trimester, since we are at 10 weeks of gestation. There's also an instructional note here at this code. Use an additional code for the particular condition, which is our psychosis. So we pull in this psychosis with the main term, psychosis, subterm, reactive. F23 will be our final code for that particular diagnosis. So that takes care of our 3 diagnosis codes here. Now we need to go ahead and code for the actual procedure. Abortion with subterm vacuum. This gives us all 7 characters, 10A07Z6. Now, you may be asking yourself, we have this 10 weeks gestation documented. Why are we not pulling in a Z3A code for weeks of gestation? Because remember, we need to include those on the mother's record. Well, if you go back, I think it's the 2nd or 3rd page of the chapter, there's a section titled Complications Associated with Abortion. And here it states that Z3A codes for weeks of gestation should not be assigned for pregnancies with abortive outcomes. And that's what we have here. So we are not pulling in that Z3A code. Let's go ahead and take a look at another example from exercise 24.2. Here we have inadvertent spontaneous abortion complete, prompted by radiation treatment damage to the fetus, single fetus. So unlike our previous example where we had a planned encounter for the elective abortion, here we just have an abortion that happened naturally. It wasn't a planned procedure. It was just nature taking its course, and we happen to have this spontaneous complete abortion. So that is where we are going to begin in the alphabetic index, CM, main term of abortion, and here you find the 2 non-essential modifiers, complete and spontaneous, which leads us to code 003.9. Then we need to pull in that complication of the pregnancy code. So let's take a step back and think about this one. There actually was damage, a complication with the fetus due to radiation treatment. So this is kind of an interesting way we're going to get to this code. We'll begin with our main term of pregnancy complicated by, and here we remember we have damage to the fetus. So we're going to go to complicated by fetal damage. So fetal damage from, and there is actually a specific subterm for radiation. This leads us to code 035.6. Again, we always check the tabular list where we will pull in our placeholders as needed because we have to pull in the 7th character 0 for a single gestation, remembering these 2 X's here to fill in those values to make sure the 0 is in the 7th character spot. Then I'm not going to ask you to do this on a quiz, and we've mentioned this in the past. This external causes index that usually relates back to injuries, giving more information about injuries mostly for research purposes. Here we have an injury to the fetus caused by radiation treatment. So thinking back to this external causes index, it has its own separate index found just prior to the tabular list in your code book. There we find a main term for radiation exposure to, and we have a very specific subterm here that relates to our exercise. Radiation, complication of or abnormal reaction to medical radiation therapy. or radiotherapy. This leads us to code Y84.2. So again, we'll talk more about these external cause index codes in a few weeks when we discuss our injuries chapter. As usual, I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me this week, and happy coding!